This is a recording with Harris Smart, longtime Subud member and currently the editor of Subud Voice. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And Harris, can you start out by telling us a little bit what was it like before you found and came into Subud? What were you doing back then?
Well, to go right back to the beginning, I guess I was born in 1942, July 1942. So I'm just about to turn 82. Probably one of the most significant things about my early life was my father died when I was very young. My father came back from the war and studied for a year to be a school teacher, and then suddenly fell very ill and was found he had a brain tumor. He went into hospital, and within 3 weeks he died. A kind of interesting thing that happened there was my mother, after he died, my mother went into the hospital to collect his things. And one of the other men who'd been in the same ward as my father said that just before he died, my father sat up in bed and said, "I must go into the other room now," and promptly died. And I've always thought that was a very evocative way that the dying is really just passing from one room into another room. Uh, so after that, my mother and sister and I went to live with my grandparents, and I grew up. My father had been a Catholic and my mother a Protestant. In those days, that was very significant. And the Protestant part, they had to bring the children up as Catholics. So my mother was very faithful to that promise, and she brought us up as Catholics. We went to Catholic schools, but then I gradually lost faith in the Catholic Church. One sort of pillar of Catholicism fell after another, and by the time I was about 17 or 18, I consider myself to be an atheist. But one other significant thing I should mention connected to my father's death was that life was never really good from then on for my mother and my sister. They were very badly affected by my father's death. My sister had a very disturbed life and she eventually committed suicide. And it's kind of an indication of how the effects of war reach out into future generations, because my father's injury was diagnosed as having been, a result of his war service. So it's very terrible. I mean, we see on our television screens at the moment Gaza and we see Ukraine, but the effects of war just go on and on and on. It's a very terrible thing. Anyway, by the time I was 16 or 17, I felt myself to be an atheist. But the one part of the Catholic Church that stayed with me was the saints and the mystics. This idea that you could have not just a belief in God, but you could have an actual living experience of God. You could experience God as a reality. And so even though I'd lost faith in every other aspect of the Catholic Church, that stayed with me. And a turning point for me was one day in the university library, I saw a book of photographs about the island of Bali, and that depicted various trance dances and sort of mystical activities on the island of Bali. And in those photographs, I saw the possibility of some kind of supernatural connection. So in my final year at university, I won a big essay prize. I had some money. So I went to Bali to experience these trance dances and so on. And I did go to Bali and I witnessed these dances, but I quickly saw that that wasn't going to be a path that I could adopt, and that if you wanted to experience other realms through those activities, you really had to be a Balinese or spend the rest of your life in Bali, totally absorbing the culture. So I left Bali, but as a result of that journey, I wrote some short stories. And as a result of those short stories, I won a fellowship to go to the creative writing department at Stanford University. And it was a very exciting time to be in California. It was the 1960s. So you had, all these activities like hippies and anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. It was a very lively, very colorful time. And during that time, I met Hussein Chung, who was, of course, a master at psychodrama, the techniques of psychodrama. And Hussein was very well known in the Bay Area at that time. He used to run these psychodrama marathons where it would be non-stop psychodrama from Friday night through to Sunday morning, with usually involving about 40 people. And I became very involved in that psychodrama, and I went through various forms of training that Hussein was offering to become a psychodramatic actor and a director of psychodrama. And eventually, those of us who were doing psychodrama with him, we found out that he was involved in some kind of spiritual movement. And one day I went to talk to him about that. And I said, "What's this spiritual movement you're involved in?" And he said, "Subud." And as soon as he said that word Subud, I knew that that was the thing I'd been looking for. That was the pathway to this a mystical experience, this direct contact with God that I'd been trying to find. And I know that other Subud members have had that experience too. You just hear the word Subud and it's kind of like dropping it's kind of like you've got a glass of cloudy fluid and you drop a catalyst in it and suddenly the glass goes clear. That was the effect of hearing the word Subud had on me.
Wow.
And so I started attending the Palo Alto group, or which we actually met in Los Altos. And it was a very strong experience because in those days, Subud was in hired a shop front to do the latihan. And those of us who were who were probationers, we sat behind a curtain with the latihan going on behind the curtain. So we were very much exposed to the power of the latihan. And after I'd been doing it for about 6 weeks, one night I began to have this very strange experience. And it was kind of like I felt this bowl of gold, like a bowl of molten gold in my solar plexus. And then that bowl kind of broke, and all this golden fluid went flowing through my body. And I could feel it flowing even through the tiny capillaries in my fingers. And so I knew I'd had some kind of Subud experience. And I went back to Hussein and I said, "Well, look, I think I've been opened. I think I've had a spontaneous opening." And Hussein said, "Okay, but you better wait for the 3 months anyway." So I waited for the 3 months, and that was, that was good. I was opened, but the really spectacular experience was that one I'd had after I'd been attending as a probationer for about 6 weeks. And after that, I began to have some powerful experiences. One night I was lying in bed, and then I heard a voice saying, "Get up and walk." And I just kind of ignored it. And this voice kept on saying, "Get up and walk." So I got up and I started walking without any idea where I was going to walk to. But my feet were guided. And so I walked down the driveway of the house, and my feet turned me left, and then I worked down the street and come to a cross street, and again my feet would be guided to go left or right. And I had no idea where I was going to end up. And I was just moving into a part of Palo Alto I'd never been before. And then I looked across the street and I saw a Catholic church. And I thought, oh, this was the purpose of this journey, was to see this church. And it was nighttime, so the church was all closed up. But I came back the next day and I went inside the church. And it didn't give me a feeling that I wanted to return to being a Catholic. But what it did do was kind of rid me of any negative feelings that I had about being a Catholic. any of the feelings of anger I had about my education. That was all cleansed. So yeah, that was my experience. Yeah.
Have you had many experiences around Bapak or with Bapak?
Yes. For example, one time I was chairman of the Subud group in Melbourne when Bapak was to make a visit, when Bapak came to visit the group. And at that time on the Subud property in Melbourne, we had a latihan hall, and we also had a house where Bapak was staying when he came to visit, Bapak and all the members of his entourage. Anyway, the night before Bapak came, I had a very vivid dream. And in this dream, we were all gathered in the latihan hall, and Bapak was giving a talk. And then I heard this kind of whisper go around the room. And then the person in front of me turned round and he said to me, Bapak needs to go to the toilet and you have to take him. And I said, well, why do I have to take him? And this person said, because you're the chairman. So anyway, Bapak and I then left the latihan hall and walked across to the house where he was staying. But it had changed because in reality, there was just a lawn between the latihan hall and the house. But in the dream, this had been converted into a cactus garden full of rocks, full of sharp rocks. And I was terrified that Bapak was going to have a fall and hurt himself, break some bones, and that it would be my fault. But anyway, we reached the house safely, and Bapak went in to go to the bathroom, and I was sitting outside. And I looked up and I saw that the house went on for many, many levels. And there were people moving around on all these levels, performing various activities. And then I looked down and I saw that the house went down for many, many levels. And again, there were people there moving around doing things. And I thought to myself, wow, this house is much bigger than I ever thought. And I think it was some kind of indication of the many levels that there are in Subud.
Hmm.
But also, I have lots of memories of funny things that happened with Bapak. One time, Bapak was in Sydney giving a talk, and he was talking away. And suddenly, a man in the audience shouted out, he said, Bapak, that's a load of rubbish. And of course, there was a tremendous shock in the auditorium that anyone should be so disrespectful of Bapak. And Bapak, just very quietly and calmly, he turned to Sharif and said, is he a helper? Yeah, so
So what happened after that?
beg your pardon?
What happened after that with that fellow?
No, it's just passed on. It was just that Bapak's response was so no anger, no shock, just this rather funny question: is he a helper?
Yeah.
Another experience I had was, I would often go to Jalandak for Bapak's birthday celebrations or for Ramadan, and of course it was the custom at the end of Ramadan on Eid al-Fitr that all the people, because he had as many as 1,000 people would come to Wisma Subud for the end of Ramadan. And the custom was that Bapak, sat in a chair with his family around him. And then everyone who wanted to do sungkum to Bapak would stand in a queue. And then the last 10 meters or so before you reached Bapak, you had to approach on your knees. And this kind of rankled with me because my background is Irish, and Australian, and we're very democratic and egalitarian, and this kind of rather feudal custom, I felt uncomfortable with it. I did it. I approached Bapak on my knees, but part of me was resisting it, and then I reached Bapak, and as you know, you would put your forehead on his knee, and he would touch your back, and I felt such love and compassion come from Bapak, and completely dispel any of those negative feelings that I had. Another time, once when Bapak was visiting Melbourne, I wanted to take a photograph of him because I'd taken a lot of photographs of him when he was giving talks, but it was always difficult to get close enough. So I approached Sharif if he would ask Bapak if I could take a photograph of him, like a posed photograph. And what was significant about this was Bapak gave it so much attention. Here was I, just, an insignificant Subud member wanting to take a photograph. And Bapak, should he wear his hat? Should he not wear his hat? Where should we take the photograph? He paid an enormous amount of attention to this matter. And anyway, I took the photograph, and I think because I felt very self-conscious, it wasn't a very good photograph. But anyway, those were some of the experiences I had with Bapak, I guess. Yeah, so, after that time in California at Stanford, I came back to Australia, and before I went to California, I'd had a job as a teacher. And then when I got that fellowship at Stanford, I swore to myself that whatever else happened to me in my life, I would never come back to this teaching job. And of course, when I came back from Stanford, I looked for a job for about 6 months and I could never find anything. And finally, I had to go back to exactly the same job that I had before I went to Stanford. And sometimes life rubs your nose in it, if you know what I mean. And of course, the thing that often happens after you join Subud is that you experience a complete loss of self. Everything that you were gets taken away from you, all your skills and abilities. And I know of people who were never themselves again for like 10 years after they were open. But in my case, it lasted for several years. I was barely able to function. Fortunately, when I was a teacher, I had my own office. So I used to go and teach for a couple of hours, and then I'd go back into my office and just shake for a couple of hours to recover. But and once I found out the students had a nickname for me, and they called me the ghost who walks, and that was an indication of the state I was in. But I became more and more involved in Subud. I became chairman of the group. And then I became the representative for the Asian zone, like the zone representative. And at that point, the Asian zone was very active. There were about 16 countries in it, and all had active memberships: Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia. About 16 countries altogether. And we used to have these zone conferences where a lot of people would turn up, and Bapak would give talks, and they were quite significant events. And at the end of one of those conferences, Bapak gave a talk to just a small group of people. It was about 20 people. And a number of significant things happened in that talk. One was the Subud Welfare Organization had been set up, and Bapak was asked to give a name to the Subud Welfare Organization. And so he said the name should be Susila Budi Dharma. And there was a little bit of kind of discomfort in the audience. And Sharif had the courage to say to Bapak, Bapak, Susila Budi Dharma is the name of the whole organization. And Bapak said, oh, yes, that's right. Well, just call it Susila Dharma then. So that's how Susila Dharma got its name. But at that time, there was a lot of interest in making a film about Subud. And all the people who had a background in filmmaking were very interested in this. And I had a background in filmmaking because I had now become a television producer with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And so Bapak said, no, it's not yet time to make a film about Subud because there's not yet enough evidence on the ground. There's not enough proof. However, he said, someone should write a book about Subud. And he went on to define what the characteristics of this book should be. And he said the book should show the proof, the evidence, and the reality of Subud. And it should show that Subud had every kind of thing in it. And he sort of put his finger on Richard Engels, who was in the audience, and he said Richard could write such a book. And I know that became quite a burden for Richard because he felt he should write the book, and he tried to write the book, and he never quite produced the book that Bapak had been talking about, but he did produce a wonderful autobiography about the many amazing experiences that he'd had in his life. Another thing that came up in that meeting was that Bapak talked about seeker, and he said that in the future, seeker would have the power to open people. Subud performers like clowns would have the ability to awaken the latihan in people. Anyway, I heard that what Bapak had said about a book about Subud, and I didn't presume that I could write the book that Bapak was talking about, but I thought I could write a book, and I set out on that journey. I left my job, and I traveled around the world, interviewing Subud members and visiting Subud projects. And as a result of that, I wrote a book called 16 Steps, which was a collection of interviews. And it was a book that was thought quite well of at the time. And a lot of people thought it was a book that they could give to relatives and people interested in Subud. Yeah. So and then I've written several more books about Subud, and I have done a lot of writing for Subud, contributing to Subud magazines and so on. And Elena Leonard, a Subud member in England, shortly after Bapak died in 1987, she felt that she could contribute something to keeping the memory of Bapak alive and providing a kind of focal point for Subud. And she started this magazine called Subud Voice, which she then continued to edit for the next 13 years until she became unwell. And it was it was really at that time, it was the only magazine in Subud. Since then, there have been many magazines, but Subud Voice was the original one. And I often contributed articles to it. But then I think it was the year 2000, she couldn't do it anymore. And so I took over as the editor, supported by Ruckman Connolly and Bradford Temple, who had, of course, had a very successful enterprise called Connolly Temple. And they supported me to become the editor. And I've been the editor ever since. Elena edited it for 13 years, and now I've been editing it for, I guess it's 24 years, 12 issues a year. And my proudest boast is, touch wood, I've always managed to bring it out on the first of the month for those 24 years. And it's still going strong. We still have a readership. It's been difficult to keep it floating financially, but somehow we've always managed.
Yeah, it's a good way for Subud people to keep kind of a contact with each other and hear
Yes,
stories.
it's been very good for me because it keeps me in touch with the Subud world. and has given me something to do that's not very, very difficult for me to do. And yeah, it's been very good for me, and appreciated in the Subud world, given me a role in the Subud world. And of course, not just me who does it. I work very closely with Marcus Bolt, Subud member in England, who does the layout. And also we have a woman here in Australia, Kitka, a Subud member originally from Finland, who looks after all the website of it. So it's a very happy collaborative enterprise. We don't make money, but I think we do provide a useful service. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your email about Project Sunrise in Sydney. Do you want to
Yes.
talk about that?
Yes. I think obviously a very important phase in the development of Subud was going back to the World Congress, which was held in 1971, when Bapak, first put forward the idea of a bank. And then after that, various major projects were put forward, were developed, because Bapak was saying that the small enterprises that people were doing, like health food restaurants and bookstores, they were all very well, but what Subud should be doing was very big enterprises like cement factories and five-star hotels. And of course, the first of these projects was the Joyo building. It's a 14-story office block in Jakarta. And that was quickly followed by other projects around the world, like Anugraha in the UK. And then there was an idea for a project in Holland and another one in California. And then in New South Wales, in Sydney, a man called Rumdun Simpson came up with the idea of doing a project there. And this had been directly inspired by a talk which Bapak had given in the Joyo building, I think when the Joyo building was inaugurated. And Bapak said that Subud should have big latihan halls. And I think he specified we should have a 10 meter space in which to move freely around. And Rumdun Simpson heard this, and Rumdun was one of those people who was very sincere in his latihan and his relationship to Bapak. So he came back to Sydney and looked around for a place where such a hall could be created. And of course, Sydney is a harbour city, but at that time, a harbour which kind of directed right into the centre of the city had been wound up and moved somewhere else. And so a large area of land adjoining this old harbour, where there are old railway yards and things like that, this had become vacant. And so Rumdun had the idea that this could become a place where this hall that Bapak had talked about could be developed. So there was a hotel in this area. The area is called Piermont in Sydney. There was a hotel. So some money was raised and this hotel was purchased, and it became a kind of center for developing this project. And the other thing that happened was the American Subud member, Lukman McKinley, who had a very brilliant career. He was one of those multi-talents. He could write, he could make films. For a while, he had an animated film studio in Indonesia. And Bapak was always urging him to become an architect. And he would often have testing sessions where he would test about Lukman being an architect. And finally, Lukman did do some training as an architect, I think only for about 1 year. And in that year, he actually became a big influence on the professors in the architecture school, because Lukman was never an architect in the conventional sense, but he was an architect in a highly imaginative sense. He was a visionary architect. So he began to work with Rumdun in Sydney to come up with a very visionary concept that went far beyond the idea of just a latihan hall, and became a kind of complete transformation of this area in Sydney. Became a master plan which included an exhibition centre, a theme park, gardens, and all kinds of activities. And the project went very well for a while. And then what happened was, it was called Project Sunrise. Project Sunrise handed over all the planning work that it had done to the New South Wales government, and that largely became the master plan for what subsequently happened in that land. But in return, the New South Wales government gave a piece of the land to Project Sunrise, and that was going to be the site for a theme park. But unfortunately, the site for the theme park, they were never able to raise the money for it, because it happened at a time when there was a financial crisis, and the funding they hoped to get for the theme park didn't come through. So it kind of evolved into a company called Creative Design and Technology, which was in which Lookman and Rumdum were again involved. And a lot of plans were developed for projects around the world, including one plan for the redevelopment of Coney Island in the United States. Unfortunately, Lookman's visions were so big, it was very, very difficult to ever be able to finance them. And eventually it was all wound up. And in general, when we look at the major projects that developed at that time, they all began with great visions and great hopes, but over the long run, they were not able to sustain themselves. Esri Joe was perhaps the longest lasting, but even, Esri Joe didn't quite fulfill the promise that we had for it at the beginning. A lot of people look back on that period and they feel, they feel despair or despondency about it. But the way I always look at it is that I think Bapak felt he had to set a certain standard in his lifetime. He had to create the level that Subud should be looking at. So even though the projects didn't work out, maybe there's going to be some time in the future when the members of Subud are going to be more capable or more able to realize their visions. And then at least we'll know the standard we should be looking at. Anyway, that's the way I've always looked at it, rather than to feel pessimistic or despondent because those projects didn't work out in the way that we had originally hoped they would.
Yeah. I feel the same way.
Beg your pardon?
It was more of a learning experience for many Subud members.
Yeah, a learning experience. Yes, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So what about your current situation? What are you doing? And you're living in what part of Australia?
So I'm still living in Australia, but about 5 years ago, I moved to northern New South Wales. It's the countryside. And there's a very good Subud group here. Subud group, we have usually about, I guess it consists of about 30 or 40 people. We usually have about 15 men at Latihan and the same number of women. And it's an area where people are very active. They have their own enterprises. And it's a very healthy, very vital, very lively Subud group. So I'm very happy to be a member of that group. I continue to do Subud Voice, and I continue to do some other writing of my own. Unfortunately, I'm not able to go to the Congress in Kalimantan that's coming up quite soon because of ill health. For about 10 years now, I've had some serious health conditions. I've had several heart attacks, and I also have cancer. Fortunately, a lot of the time, most of the time, I'm able to function very well. but it was just a little bit too much of a risk to go to Kalimantan. I've been to Kalimantan before a number of times, to Rungansari, and at one point I taught in BCU school in Rungansari over a period of about 3 years, traveling back and forth between Kalimantan and Australia. I taught in BCU school, which was a really, really great experience. A wonderful experience to be teaching those children who are so cooperative. It's just a joy and a pleasure to be a teacher in that school, and that's been a really significant part of my Subud experience. Yeah.
Do you have any other experiences that you'd like to talk about? Anything kind of that stands out in your mind?
I think it's more than any particular outstanding experience. It's more how Subud permeates the texture of your life. And, you're just constantly, every decision I make, I guess, I inwardly test about it. I say, is this right? Um, I constantly, I learn to pray. Prayer is an important part of my life. And I think, I learn the benefits of these things, the benefits of prayer. And I look back on my Subud life, and really it's been such a rich experience. I mean, I've known so many people. I've been to so many places, so many different places, had so many different experiences. And Subud has just enriched my life in so many different ways. Really, I'm just so grateful that I've come into Subud. Back at the time when I joined Subud, in California in the 1960s, like a lot of people, I was, pretty lost. I'd been, using a lot of drugs and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And really, at the time I joined Subud, I painted myself into such a black corner that I really think I might have done the same thing as my sister at that point and done away with myself if I hadn't found Subud. So even if sometimes you might feel disappointed in this or that aspect of Subud, or disappointed in my own commitment to Subud, I always give thanks to Subud that I'm here at all.
Me too. Well,
Maybe that's a good point to end. Oh, have you got another question?
I don't
Sorry?
have any more questions, but if you have anything else you'd like to add or any more comments?
Nothing else comes to mind. I think we've covered all the points that I would like to cover. So thank you very much for arranging this interview.
Okay. Thank you for doing the interview. I appreciate it.
Okay.
I'm going to stop the recording right now, but I'll continue to talk to you afterwards.
Okay, good.
Hang on just a minute.